Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to today's special edition of the Robust Opposition. I'm really happy to have with me two important guests to talk about Afghanistan, Matthew Hoh and Ryan Grimm. How you doing, guys?
Great.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Matthew has nearly 12 years experience with America's wars overseas with the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and State Department. He has been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, he resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, Matthew took part in the American occupation of Iraq. And he's also worked on Afghan and Iraq war policy operations at the Pentagon and State Department from 2002 until 2008. And his writings have appeared everywhere. He's been a guest on many programs. I'm going to post his entire bio in the comments. Ryan Grimm is the Intercept's DC bureau chief. He was previously the Washington bureau chief for the HuffPost, where he led a team that was twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won once. He grew up in rural Maryland, has been a staff reporter for Politico and the Washington City paper, and a former contributor to MSNBC. He's a contributor to the Young Turks Network, and now he's also co-hosting Rising. And he authored the book, We've Got People, From Jesse Jackson to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, The End of Big Money and the Rise of a Movement. And I interviewed him about that book in my home a couple of years ago. So again, guys, welcome to the show. I was really not familiar with the Afghan history, and I don't want to talk about too much of the history. I want to focus in on where we started to go wrong. But just for people that aren't familiar with the country, I just want to say that after 3 British-Afghan wars, Afghanistan became independent in 1921. It was a monarchy for 40 years. In 1956, they allied with the Soviet Union. In 1965, the Afghan Communist Party forms. In 73, they overthrew the last king. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan was formed. Headed by Mohammed Daoud Khan, the Republic of Afghanistan was formed. Between 1975 and 79, they wrote a new constitution which grants women's rights and modernized the state. In 1978, Khan was killed in a communist coup. Taraki and Karmal take over as president and prime minister. They proclaim independence from the Soviet Union and say their policies will be based on Islamic principles, Afghan nationalism, and socioeconomic justice. Then infighting with conservative ethnic leaders opposed to social change begin. There's armed revolt in the countryside. The Mujahadeen is created to battle the Soviet-backed government. The American ambassador is killed. There's a power struggle between the president and the prime minister. The president is killed, the Soviet Union invades. And Ryan, now I want you to take it from there because it was your excellent Substack article that showed me how everything started to go wrong.
Right. So they come in and their purpose of coming in was actually to execute Amin because they thought Amin had gone too far. One thing people don't realize is that in most cases, the Soviet Union was telling its proxies and clients and allies around the world that they should not be doing, adventurism, that they should not be engaged in armed conflict where the conditions for revolution were not right, or where they as a movement were not ready to actually govern. Because even if you could take power briefly, it's worse if you take power and blow it and then set your cause back for decades. Afghanistan was one of the places where the Soviet Union urged the left wing of the Communist Party there not to try to take power. They did it anyway. They did it against the wishes of the moderate wing of the Communist Party, and there was some real unrest between those two wings of the party. But then there was also unrest within the left wing of the Communist Party, and so we saw this assassination. Amin assassinating the prime minister. And so then the Soviet Union comes in and assassinates Amin and installs its own, what they think is going to be a more reasonable leader. That person turns out to be a drunk and an incompetent clown. The party was just in general often not listening to the advice that was coming from Moscow. Moscow told them not to try to force too many cultural changes on the rural areas. Soviets had decades of experience trying to bridge the gap between intellectuals who had taken power and peasants who were interested in material gains, but not necessarily so interested in having these grad students tell them how to live their lives. And so, that blew up in their faces and cost them some support. The United States, though, saw an opportunity post-Vietnam to inflict a Vietnam on the Soviet Union, and so began funding the Mujahadeen to cause a lot of problems for the Soviet-backed government. So in February of '89, the Soviet Union finally leaves. The next month, these kind of 7 Mujahideen groups get together and launch an assault on the government, just very similar to how to this time. But in that occasion, even without the support of the Soviet Union, the military support of the Soviet Union, the communist government fended them off. By this time, it was run by Mohammad Najibullah and was more nationalistic in a way than communist, but social democratic nationalism or whatever. And so they fended off the Mujahideen. Mujahideen broke into internal strife, and it took them about 3 years till '92 until they were able to come into Kabul and finally, 3 years later, kick the post-Soviet government out of power. They then descended into civil war, 4 years of civil war, and from that civil war, the Taliban emerged, and they emerged victorious in, I guess, 1996, and until we kicked them out in 2001.
Okay, I want to go back to what happened during that period of time with Osama bin Laden, and this thing about the enemy of our enemy is our friend, which is a foreign policy the U.S. always seems to want to practice. He came in, and it was before the Taliban, it was before Al-Qaeda, but we did aid him. I mean, would it be fair to say that our aiding Osama bin Laden led to the creation of Al-Qaeda, or is that too extreme of a statement?
That's probably a bit much, but we certainly were happy to see him thrive and helped him thrive. Would he have done it on his own with just his own money and Saudi money? I don't know. Matthew may have an opinion on that, but whether or not he would have made it on his own, we don't know, but because we actually did help him.
Now, in the 10 years when the communists were trying to modernize, that seems to be ruined by the rise of the Taliban. Also, there was the drought between 95 and 99. Would it be fair to say that our intervening against the Soviet Union aided the rise of the Taliban? Like, if we hadn't helped them, would they have been able to gain control and keep trying to modernize?
When the Soviet Union left in 1989, they appealed to us for a national reconciliation process. Said, look, this is just a graveyard of empires. It always has been. Like, let's stop fighting here, and let's have our clients and your clients work things out among themselves. None of them have enough power to take over the country by themselves. So let's bring them together and do a reconciliation process. And the United States debated this, and there were people within the first Bush administration that wanted to do this. But there were other people who said, no, that we would rather cause more strife on the Soviet periphery, which they hoped would then kind of drift into Chechnya and other kind of Central Asian areas that would cause them even more problems. So they said, no, we're going to continue funding this violence. And it was the funding of that violence that led to the Taliban. So absolutely.
Matthew, before we talk about 9/11 and what happened after that, do you want to talk about this period of time that we just went over? Anything you want to add?
This is great, Ryan. I really appreciate you bringing this stuff up. I have rarely heard American commentators discuss with this detail and knowledge. And in particular, that last comment you meant, Ryan, you made about the United States support for the Mujahadeen after the Soviet Union left. I mean, there was that terrible movie, Charlie Wilson's War, that I think most people based their knowledge of Afghanistan on, which was incredibly not a very good movie in terms of its accuracy. Say what you will, Tom Hanks, but and so, yeah, this idea that in 1989, at one point, James Baker, who is George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, to paraphrase him, says something along the lines of, the Mujahideen are not interested in democracy, elections, or freedom, and neither are we. This idea that we are interested in victory. And the scale of the support for the Americans after the Soviet Union leaves is massive. I mean, it's massive. By 1992, the U.S. and the Soviets have agreed to stop sending weapons to both sides. But in 1991, just to give you an idea of how big it was still going at that point, the U.S. Congress appropriated $200 million for the Mujahideen. And even after the weapons stopped going, the U.S. still supports the various Mujahideen groups. I'll give you an example of that in 1992, 1993, Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was a Tajik leader, who people romanticize him very much, greatly. He's the Lion of Panjshir. He was the one who was one of the last holdouts against the Taliban in 2001. He also committed mass atrocities, rocketing and shelling the city of Kabul, but we tend to leave that out. But, the United States Agency for International Development in 1992, 1993 was in Afghanistan building roads to help Massoud's army move. I mean, so even after we stop sending weapons, we're still doing all these things because we want victory. But I think if there's one thing to make a point on, because Lauren, I would just love to sit here all day and talk about this. And I know you want to get on other things, but it's the idea that somehow all the powers that are involved in this thought that they can control things that they didn't understand. And also too, I don't want to take away from the agency of the Afghans who were involved either. Prime Minister Dawood, the man who overthrew the king, he makes a comment at one point that I light my American cigarettes with a Soviet lighter. Right? I mean, the idea that I am playing both superpowers off against each other. Okay, that is the leadership in Afghanistan in the 1970s. The idea, as Ryan said, about using the Mujahideen to kind of influence what's happening in Chechnya and everything. That's just not after the Soviets leave in '89. That was one of the impetuses for supporting these Islamic groups in Afghanistan. The idea being this is cooked up by Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, and then adopted by the Reagan administration. Because you have to remember, 1978, there's a lot of Islamic revolution, for lack of a better term, occurring throughout the Muslim world. All right. Of course, you have what happens in Iran, but you have situations in Pakistan and in Saudi Arabia that are close as you can get to existential threats to those governments as anyone who's alive with those governments would ever like to see. So the idea is like, how do we control that, use those forces for our advantage? Well, let's have these people go to Afghanistan, cause unrest, trouble, revolution. And because Afghanistan borders on, as Zbigniew Brzezinski describes, the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, you have that Islamic unrest move into the Islamic republics of Afghanistan and cause mass problems for the Soviet Union, try and destroy the Soviet Union from within that way. That's the type of thinking that these people have, that they can control those forces, right? And again, we see this still to this day. The U.S. alliance with via the Turks, the Qataris, the Saudis, et cetera, in Syria, that we're going to use jihadist groups in Syria to overthrow Assad, right? That somehow we're just going to make sure these jihadist groups just go west and attack Assad and not turn around and cross the literal line in the sand and go back to Iraq, where many of them came from. That's the type of thinking that people have, that they can control these events. I would recommend to people, if you are interested in the Soviet Union's decision-making going into Afghanistan in 1979, The National Security Archives at George Washington University has a trove of documents from the Politburo. And it is just absolutely amazing. Some of those discussions, some of the reasons why the Soviet Union goes into Afghanistan. Well, the Americans had just lost their bases in Iran. And the Soviet Politburo is saying to each other, if we don't go into Afghanistan, the Americans will. Right. So like that, which is very similar to why the British went into Afghanistan in the 19th century, because they were afraid that the Russians at the time, Tsarist Russia, was going to invade India via Afghanistan. Turns out, as far as historians and archivists can find, there was never any desire on Tsarist Russia to invade India via Afghanistan, but the Brits launched at least 3 expeditions and invasions and occupations of Afghanistan because of that fear. So it's, the idea being is that you can decry yourself, Laura, and make fun of yourself for being a history nerd. But if you don't have history nerds like yourself, and obviously Ryan is, and I totally am, this is how things can be repeated, and we keep seeing the same things. But I think that the point being about this period is that what we see with Afghanistan now is a living legacy of the Cold War. Right.
It's called blowback. And, my favorite quote is George Santayana's, "Those who don't understand history are condemned to repeat it," which is why I want to talk about this history, because none of the mainstream media are talking about it. They're focusing on, this botched exit, which I want to get to sort of at the end of the program. But moving back to our history lesson here, and you write about this, Ryan, so I want you to pick this up. In 2001, the Taliban, they offered to turn over Osama bin Laden to a third party, and we don't accept that, and we attack them. Talk about that.
Right. Well, they realized immediately that they were not going to be able to stand up to any significant effort to topple them from the U.S. So they were ready to capitulate very quickly. Anand Gopal in No Good Men Among the Living writes about this meeting in which Mullah Omar says that he's ready to surrender and goes into hiding, and they get the feelers out to say, like, we're done, like, this is over, and they said, look, we'll turn over bin Laden. They had 2 demands. They said they wanted evidence that he did it, and that they would not hand him directly to the United States because that would be humiliating, but they would happily turn them over to some third party that they would agree on, probably end up being Pakistan or something like that. Either way, he winds up in our hands. Yeah. And so it shouldn't have been hard at all to get direct evidence that he did it, since he was, if I recall correctly, he was claiming responsibility for it. So, okay, that box is checked. Second, all right, we're sending a Pakistani plane, have him on it. And we said no. We wanted total war, total annihilation, and I guess we thought we were going to capture him. He slipped out, and so. But then shortly after that, the Taliban gave up. All the Taliban fighters went back to their farms, and it was assumed that, like, this was the new normal. Like, this is it. Like, this is the new regime. It's a bunch of warlords that the U.S. is backing, but there's this UN mandate and yada yada yada. The problem was that the U.S. was still bloodthirsty and was still demanding the heads of Taliban and Al Qaeda figures. There weren't really any left. Al Qaeda had completely fled. Taliban had melted away, and so the warlords, knowing that there was demand and that money to be paid as well, and also, like, favor, like, if you're a warlord and you turn over Taliban fighters, that's good for your favor with your puppet masters. So they just found a bunch of their rivals and turned each other in. He has an incredible anecdote in his book, Anand Gopal does, of these 2 different kind of warlord sects, rival sects, both turning each other in to the U.S. as Taliban, and both getting massacred by U.S. troops. So it's just an absolutely bloody, horrific period for several years. the entire purpose was this. There was no development, nothing decent was happening. And so eventually people were like, let's get the Taliban back. And the Taliban gets the band back together. And here we are.
2004, they have a new constitution. Karzai wins the presidency. 2005, they have parliamentary elections. 2006, the Taliban and Al Qaeda are still fighting there.
Or fighting there again, because they took
there again. Okay.
Took a long break.
You know, I had read that when they were driven from power, the population was happy to see them go, but the US managed to make them popular again based on the things that you were just talking about, no efforts at reconstruction. So why wasn't Karzai able to form a democracy and improve the country? What's your analysis there, Matthew?
Quick anecdote. When I was in Afghanistan in 2009, I walked up to two Afghan colleagues and they were bickering, giving each other a hard time about something. And the one turned to me, one of them could speak English, the other couldn't, turned to me and said to me, "This guy's Al Qaeda, give me money." Right. I mean, like this is not something that happened occasionally. This dominated American, but Larry Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, he'll tell you that the first 700, 800 detainees that the United States took in Afghanistan were not captured by American forces. They were just given to us by people. Right. I mean, no idea. And a lot of those men ended up in Guantanamo Bay. Right. I mean, like, we have no idea why we had some. And so, yeah, that idea of, entering into this war, a civil war of our making, of course, right. Or our involvement. I mean, however much you want to put on the United States. But the idea that we're going to come into the civil war, take one side out of power, put the other side into power, follow a divide and conquer strategy, utilizing basically taking out of power a theocratic repressive regime, putting in power a kleptocratic repressive regime, which was composed of the warlords and drug lords that the Taliban had removed from power. I mean, you can talk to Afghans who were in Afghanistan in 2001 who were very happy with the Taliban being kicked out, and then horrified that we put back into power the warlords.
So those guys.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Oh my God, this again. The Taliban's origin story is that in 1994, things are so bad. The banditry, the way the warlords are controlling things, the way they are preying upon the people, that the Taliban rise up to defend the people and remove the warlords. And there is a degree of truth to that. The man who was the most prominent, the senior, the head warlord in Kandahar province at that time where the Taliban, rose up, was a guy named Gul Urga-Shirzai. He's the man who prompted, right, the Taliban to come together and do all this. Who does the United States put back into power in Kandahar? Gul Urga-Shirzai. And this time behind him, we put our special operations and a lot of money and everything else. And so to Ryan's point, these warlords now have a chance for victory over these people, right? I mean, so that's what you're basically continuing the war by refusing to negotiate, refusing surrender. And that is fine for Bush and his people. You have to look at, I think, the Bush White House, the Bush National Security Council, the Bush State Department, the Defense Department, the people who populated that. These were neoconservatives. They came out of Chicago school. These were ardent believers in the American empire. They believed in the maintenance of it and the expansion. So some of what they wanted to do in Afghanistan was to mete out punishment, right? You defied the empire, to put it simply, you need to be punished, as well as you have to regain the credibility of the empire. You have to make up for this humiliation of being attacked like this. But there's also within that group of neoconservatives, which makes them different than, like, say, the people that Trump brought into power, the John Kellys, the Jim Mattises, the H.R. McMasters, who subscribed to a different form of empire. I think you had these people, these Paul Wolfowitzes, Zalmay Khalizads, et cetera, in the Bush administration, who believed as part of the empire was this neoliberal experiment, was that, as well as nation building experiment. It's to, make Afghanistan an arm image. That's what's best for the world, and ultimately what is best for the United States. And I can say that when I was in Afghanistan in 2005, when I was on the Iraq desk in 2005 at the State Department, I wasn't on the Afghan desk, certainly familiar with what was going on there. But at that point, 2005, Hamid Karzai was being belittled as the mayor of Kabul. And there was a hysteria. There was a fear that this American experiment in Afghanistan was not going to work. And I think you have to also, too, recall the books by Sam Huntington, The Clash of Civilization, and Francis Fukuyama, The End of History. Those books, I think, reflected very clearly the thoughts, thinkings, philosophies, ideals of many in Washington, D.C., especially among the foreign policy community. And these books were celebrations of their beliefs, of their success. And so these are people who have felt that they have won, and here is a chance to prove it again in Afghanistan. So the hysteria about Karzai being the mayor of Kabul, we need to do something about this. So on top of Ryan's point, to move past the 03, 04 into 05, 06 period, where people are saying, look, this is really not good, particularly in the South and the East. And it's not as if the Taliban invade back in from Pakistan. It always appeared to me as if they're pulled back in by the people in the South and the East, right? They're looking for help because they're being preyed upon. In response to this, the United States and NATO says, well, we need to expand. We need to put more effort into here. And so starting in 05, 06, NATO begins expanding counterclockwise from the north. So that by the time the Americans become involved, the Americans start expanding their part of the war in 2008. And with that, you can see this decision for military victory, the idea that we are going to subjugate the Pashtuns, this divide and conquer strategy that culminates in last week's, taking of Kabul by the Taliban. Because if you choose a victory-only strategy, hey, guess what? This is what defeat looks like. This and this is what bothers me. There's a lot of things, Lauren, that are bothering me, a lot of things that are upsetting me, but perhaps the infantile nature of American commentary on this war, right? This, oh my gosh, the hand-wringing over the fact that the Taliban actually did something to win the war. The infantile nature of that. The United States should just be able to go and do as it please, and there will be no repercussions, consequences, counteractions. I think that's a good summation of the last 20 years, or maybe even longer, the last 40 years.
Right. The craziest example of that is this outrage that pundits have that the U.S. has to negotiate with the Taliban to get outside of the airport and to go around Kabul, or to get access from Kabul to the airport. We are utterly outraged at that fact. Who do they think they are? How dare they?
Yeah.
It's like, this is what defeat looks like. You don't run Kabul anymore.
I want to get back to something that you just said about the media, and also what Ryan just said about the corruption. So Rachel Maddow said the other night that the Afghan government was corrupt. This is what she's blaming it on. So my question is, what about the U.S. Contractors? SIGAR, and I don't know what that stands for, maybe you could say, but they're supposed to identify waste, fraud, and abuse. They identified 30% of what we spent over there in reconstruction in waste. There was one example, I just wrote the initials, the MRAP. I think it was some sort of armored vehicle program. They wasted $5 billion on this, and then 2 weeks later, they took them out of commission, or 2 months later, something like that. Wherever I was getting this information, I wrote the note, contracting becomes an end in itself. Christian Parenti, who was interviewed by Crystal Ball the other day, said that Reconstruction was privately controlled by the for-profit NGOs. He called them Beltway bandits. There was no economic improvement for the average Afghani. And I think that reminds me of all these, you talk about neoliberalism and the Chicago boys. People say that when neoliberalism was introduced into all these South American countries, that's when you could see the GDP, the CDP, whatever the individual thing is, drop, because they would bring in the IMF and the World Bank would loan all this money, and they would bring in, these big contractors, Halliburton, Fluor, Bechtel, build these big reconstruction projects that may or may not even be needed, get these countries in debt, not even hire like local people. I personally feel when people say Iraq was about the oil, my understanding is that the US oil companies had production agreements with the Iraqi oil companies, and which were disrupted after the war. And really what it was all about was reconstruction contracts for Cheney's company, Halliburton, and the other ones. So I wanted to know what you thought about that, like the neoliberal aspect with these private for-profit companies controlling the reconstruction, combined with the neoconservative thing that it is our American exceptionalism to instill, democracy all around the world. Who wants to comment on that?
I'll say one quick thing. So Sagar is the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, and their reports combined with the Afghanistan papers that the Post published tell you everything that you would have needed to know, but even before last weekend. But sure, the Afghan elite were entirely soaked through with corruption. They were put there by us in completely corrupt fashion. We knew that they were corrupt. Sarah Chase, who Matthew probably knows, lived there for a very long time, wrote a great book called Thieves of State, identifying the corruption of the both Afghan elite and the corruption that was fueled by the U.S. as the greatest threat to the project. That if it didn't get turned around, that the project would fail. And there was an explicit decision made in 2011 to not focus on corruption. That was the wrong path to take. And once that decision was made, according to Chase, forget about it. It was over, because it was corruption and instability that had fueled the rise of the Taliban in the first place, as Matthew said. And so if you can have a kleptocratic repressive regime, or you can have a theocratic repressive regime, people are going to take the theocratic one. And they would probably choose that here in the United States too.
And they sort of are, with the big rise in Trump, And
that's where these strong
Christians in our state. I want to mention that Matthew also lives in North Carolina.
Yeah, and I think that's a good parallel. I mean, it's fraught with nuance and complexity and everything, I think. But this idea that if you do look at the United States, why do people say they support Trump over Biden? It's because the Democrats are corrupt. I mean, that's what you hear this here. They're corrupt. They're this elite that is corrupt. They're taking from us, right? That, on and on. So again, I don't want to compare it directly, but you can understand that type of attitude. With regards to the corruption, a lot of this goes back to the 90s. I think this is where you have the outsourcing of the Department of Defense, the outsourcing of government functions really comes into play in the Clinton administration. They've been talked about for a while, but under the Clinton administration, you really start to see what was being called outsourcing. By the time I get to the Pentagon in 2002, every GS, every U.S. government civilian worker has to write out a statement why their job should not be privatized. I mean, women and men who have been working in the Pentagon for 20, 25 years, great at their job, having to defend their job against contractors through written statements of their own. I get to Iraq in 2004. And what I learned is that these contractors who are all coming to Iraq to do this work, they seem to have gotten their act together in the Balkans. So what you can see is that in the Balkans effort, it's a lot of private corporations are used. And I think, to your point, I think there's a lot to say about Cheney and Halliburton. But when you get to talk about the corruption, look, everything I saw as, being a part of the State Department team in Iraq in 04 and 05, and then being again around that and then being back in Afghanistan in 09, is that American prime contractors took 40% off of the contract right away for overhead and management, right away, 40%. So say in the case of the Iraq war, and I think you really can't separate the two. These wars are inseparable. All the wars in the Muslim world are inseparable in many ways. But so in Iraq, in 2003, or early 2004, the United States Congress appropriated $16 billion for what was called the Iraq Relief and Reconstruction Fund. Of that $16 billion, about $4 billion never even left the United States. Went right into the pockets for overhead and maintenance costs, right? Even higher, actually, I'm sorry, 40%. So you're talking about $6-7 billion of that went into the pockets, right? And then, of course, then it's subcontracted out. I mean, so you're talking about everything that we knew in Iraq and Afghanistan was that of every dollar appropriated by the Congress to be used in Afghanistan for reconstruction, only about 10 cents made it to the actual project.
Right.
By the time the Americans took it, the prime contractors took it, by the time the subcontractors took it, then of course, I mean, the corruption in Afghanistan only occurred because we created it. It was only there because of the United States. And I'd like to remind people that these reconstruction efforts had nothing to do with the benefit of the Iraqi people, the Afghan people. The US military has a doctrine called money as a weapon system. The idea behind the money spent is all for political purposes, you know, military victory, et cetera, that somehow you're going to buy support. You're going to, and the fallacy in that, is just, you know, again, we can kind of use an American parallel. Say you go to a rural conservative county in the United States and you say to them, if I build you guys a new school, will you support abortion? No one is going to do that. But that was literally the level of thinking of how we were going to use this money to win hearts and minds. Yeah. That by building these things, by connecting the Afghans to their government, et cetera, they will just forget about the past 30, 40 years of war. They will forget about the government that's been trying to prey on them. They will forget about how Americans, you know, 3 months ago came to this village and killed a child, you know, this, because we built them a school. That was the magical thinking that pervades so much of, you know, again, the neoconservative or liberal interventionist, humanitarian interventionist thinking that underlay the strategies of these wars that the United States tried.
Northrop Grumman boasted a 1,196% returns. And according to Foreign Policy magazine, most of the $145 billion spent by the US on reconstruction and related activities in Afghanistan was siphoned away by the defense industry, quote, because of heavy reliance on a complex ecosystem of defense contractors, Washington banditry and aid contractors, between 80 and 90% of outlays actually return to the US economy. So this is why, you know, the war is a big jobs program.
I had sort of joked on Twitter that people were complaining about the trillions of dollars that were lost on this war. And I said, well, most of it never left Northern Virginia. Don't worry. Yeah. And it didn't. Like if you go look at Northern Virginia now compared to Northern Virginia in 2001, you can see precisely what was built by these two wars.
Exactly. And to Ryan's point, to make it even more stark, and is the fact that the wealthiest part of the United States is the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Prior to these wars, I believe it was Silicon Valley. Prior to, in other times in our history, it's been New York or it's been Dallas and Tulsa because of the oil. But since these wars, the wealthiest part of the United States are the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Something like, 6 out of the top 9 wealthiest counties are D.C. suburbs. And it is simply because of these wars. The United States federal budget has not grown anywhere near the war budget has. So, I mean, this is where the money has been gone. And you can, as Ryan said, whether it's Maryland or Virginia, if you knew that area 20 years ago and you woke up there now, you'd have no idea where you were.
We did some reconstruction.
Yeah, exactly.
Getting back to the last 10 years. So in 2009, Obama does the surge over which you resigned. 2010, Petraeus resigns, McChrystal is put in. 2011, they kill Osama bin Laden. 2012, Karzai wants the US out. 2013, the Afghan army takes over. 2014, Obama puts forth a timetable to reduce the troops. Same year, Ghani becomes president. NATO ends their combat mission. 2015, Obama abandons his plan to withdraw. 2017, even though he said he wanted to get out, Trump keeps the troops. And then in 2019, the US and the Taliban signed a deal. So all this period of 10 years, they're trying to win this war militarily. They keep telling us this is going to do it, surge is going to do it, this is going to do it. And what the Afghanistan papers show is that they were all lying through their teeth, because privately they said they didn't know what they were doing. They were very pessimistic, but they didn't, tell the American people. And it's very possible, who knows if they even told the president. What is your thinking about that? Because Biden is getting a lot of criticism right now. I find it ironic that both the left and the right are criticizing Biden for what I think is an excellent decision to finally do this, and he's taking the flack. But he's basically being accused of lying by saying that we had no intelligence about this. Do you think it's possible that they even keep the real information from the ultimate decision maker?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a great example of this. So when I resigned, and I had my celebrity, and I was on the Today Show and all that stuff, Chuck Hagel and David Boren, two former senators who now are the co-chairs of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, called me in to testify to the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, mainly because both Hagel and Boren were at universities now, and they had a lot of Army and Marine and Navy and Air Force officers coming through the school. And what Hagel and Boren wanted to find out and figure out and wanted to know was, how come the stuff that you, Matt, are saying is the same as these captains and majors and lieutenant colonels are saying, and it's the complete opposite of what is going to the desk of the president? So absolutely, look, Joe Biden's not going to be on Facebook Live watching Lauren Steiner, Ryan Grimm, and Matt Hoh talk about this. All the information he gets is giving to him, and also too, you got to, I don't want to get into a psychological discussion about Joe Biden in the sense of how a man in 50 years in power is going to see things and do things and consider things. But no, I do think it's very real that the information that goes to the president is shaped greatly. It's also shaped in other people too. In St. Patrick's Day 2010, I go in to speak with Ike Skelton, who was the chair of the House Armed Services Committee at the time. So Skelton is in effect the man responsible for oversight of the armed forces for the people of the United States of America. This is, again, March of 2010. So we've been in Afghanistan for 8.5 years of direct warfare. Skelton says to me, "You're the first person to ever give me a negative briefing on Afghanistan." Later that year or the following year, I meet with Adam Smith, who is one of the two senior Democrats on the House Armed Services Committee at that point. Smith says to me, "I know the generals lie to me all the time, but there's nothing I can do about it." And then, Jack Reed, I meet with Jack Reed a year or two later, who is one or two of the top two senators for the Democrats on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And, as we're walking out, have a nice discussion with Reed about this. He gives me an hour of his time. I'm grateful. I'm walking out. His foreign policy advisor says to me, "Look, we know there's a discrepancy between what the generals are saying about this war and what's really happening there, but we don't think it's our place to get involved." All right. I mean, so there's a lot to it. One, they're lied to. No one tells them the truth. They know it. They feel they can't do anything about it. They're scared to do something about it. I think one of the best points that's made about this is in Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, where Obama says to the people who are all advocating for the escalation of the war, he says, "Show me one place where this has worked." You can't, can you? But then what choice does he have? Because I think when we talk about Obama's commitment to end the war, draw the troops down, which he is doing up until the Islamic State takes control of a good part of Syria and the Sunni areas of Iraq. And that's a different discussion about that. But I do not believe that had anything to do with Obama pulling the troops out of Iraq. Everything to do with, like, as I said earlier, the Turks, the Saudis, the Qatar, the Emiratis, the U.S. supporting those forces, and then a blowback, as you described, Lauren. But I think at that point, it becomes a political issue, always has been. And that's one thing that the Afghan papers say. They say that what the Afghan papers, what the Washington Post says about the Afghan papers, is that the decision-making for this war in Afghanistan was always directed by domestic political concerns. That was their conclusion,
That's the way everything's, and they're exploiting it right now, thinking about the midterms, how they're going to ding Biden. So here you have this big surge. It's not working. And that article that I sent you in Just Policy, Matthew, basically I summed up these two paragraphs here. I said the people didn't support the U.S. Because of the civilian deaths from the U.S. and NATO airstrikes, the poor investigations of them, and the infrequent condolence payments. 40% of the casualties were children. In 2015, 42 were killed in the bombing of the Doctors Without Borders hospital. And by mid-2019, there were more casualties by the US than by the Taliban. So the US prioritized short-term military gains over the creation of democratic institutions and protections of human rights. Mistakes were not matters of troop numbers, rules of engagement, or military strategy, but failure to realize that corruption and human rights abuses by US and Afghan forces sabotaged the overall enterprise. And I think that's really key to understanding why the American people and the media are so puzzled by the ability of the Taliban to take over. I mean, just simply militarily, there was a great article in the New York Times yesterday about how they methodically went through all the 34 provinces, negotiating surrender agreements, paying them off, and then, they freeing up their men to go out of that province into the next province, so that by the time they got to Kabul, they had all they needed. And it's just uncanny to me that nobody is explaining this to the American people. Now, Ryan, you wrote that the chaos that we're observing at the airport right now could have been avoided if the US had just surrendered to the Taliban instead of handing over the country to this government. Can you explain that to people who haven't read your Substack?
Right. And the point would be that they were never going to do that. Like nobody in the foreign policy establishment would be willing to make that suggestion, even if it meant saving lives. Even if they knew, even in hindsight, like even today, if you went into a meeting, you're like, you know what, guys, can we all just agree that if we had actually just sat down with the Taliban and turned over power in an orderly fashion to them, that this wouldn't have happened. You still wouldn't get them to agree that anybody would have done that at that moment. But that's what defeat looks like.
But so, they could have done that. Can you explain how they could?
I mean, can they, can an entity that is incapable of doing something do something? Theoretically, a country should be capable of surrendering. I can't imagine any world in which the forces that kind of run our foreign policy apparatus at this point would ever agree to do that. What they would have preferred, in fact, think about this. If the Afghan National Army had decided to put up a heroic Kobani-like stand where they throw everything they have against the Taliban, but they're overwhelmed. They lose 10 or 20,000 troops before the Taliban come marching in. The US media would be thrilled at that outcome relative to what happened. You can visualize them on cable news right now talking about this heroic stand that they made, that they threw everything they had into defending their country, but the Taliban were just too strong for them. They would rather these 20,000 people had died, so that they look like their project amounted to something, rather than it be revealed for the fiction that it was from the very beginning.
Do you believe Ghani, who said he was forced to flee to avoid bloodshed, do you think he took 169 million with him, and how could we ever know?
I don't think Ghani's a cash guy. I think he comes out of the IMF. I think all his money's, in Bitcoin or digitally transferred. Plus, I dealt with money in Iraq. I had a $50 million cash program in Iraq, and the most I ever had in my possession at one point was $24 million. You can fit $6 million in $100 bills in the standard Army duffel bag. That's how we used to transport it, actually. Put $6 million in one of those green duffel bags, and there you go. So you do the math, divide 6 into 170 million or whatever it was. It's about 30 duffel bags, probably too many for a guy like Ghani to be carrying on his back, right? So I think there, but the idea that, was he corrupt? He has since deleted his Instagram page, but his son, who had the Instagram handle Sultan Ghani, who was always posing in front of private planes, and whose last post on Instagram was him in front of a private plane saying, the only way to go from crisis to crisis is in elegance. All right. I mean, so honest to God, I'll tweet that photo later. But so no, absolutely there was corruption there. I think just the fact that here is a man who was, both elections he won were massively fraudulent. This last election had like only 10% of the people turned out to vote. And again, massively fraudulent. He put into power with him all these warlords and drug lords, I don't know if it would have been possible for him to have been in power if he didn't have them with them. I mean, that's the practical reality of what the U.S. constructed there in terms of a government. But yeah, no, I have no doubts about his corruption. Whether or not he would have been strung up like Najibullah was by the Taliban when they took power, I don't know. I get the impression that the Taliban want to put the leadership of the Taliban. The lower levels is very difficult to say. You have to remember a lot of people have only joined the Taliban in the last few months, as well as too, you've got a revenge cycle. 40 years of war, there is a massive revenge cycle occurring in Afghanistan. So, but the Taliban leadership probably would have exiled him, I think, rather than strung him up, because the Taliban want to put on a good face for the world, because the Taliban are in very economic, their economic condition is very dire. Most of Afghanistan relies on foreign assistance to survive. The only industry in Afghanistan is the poppy trade, which the Taliban are saying they're going to eradicate. So if they lose those two things, there's no income for Afghanistan. There's no revenue. There's no money. So I think the Taliban leadership, again, not the rank and file, are very concerned with the image they put forward.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. Afghanistan is one of the poorest nations in the world. As of 2020, an estimated 90% of Afghans were living below the government-determined poverty level of $2 a day. They have the second highest number of people in the world facing hunger. In latest country profile, the World Bank said the economy remains, quote, shaped by fragility and aid dependence. You were talking about the poppy trade. And I just want to go back a little bit, because you said something in an interview, Matthew, that I want you to say again here. So opium production soared during the 10-year CIA war aiding the Mujahadeen. And by 2008, opium was half of the GDP. But even while it was financing a widespread and deadly aerial spraying campaign in Colombia, the United States refused to countenance the same policy in Afghanistan. The NATO spokesman said, "We cannot be in a situation where we remove the only source of income of people who live in the second poorest country in the world without being able to provide them with an alternative." And then they talked about this local strongman who eradicated his neighbor's crop, but he left his own untouched. And you commented on that. You said, "We literally gave the guy $10 million in cash for rubbing out his competition. If you were going to write a movie about this, they'd say this is too far-fetched. No one is going to believe this. Nothing is this insane or stupid, but that's the way it is." And now the UN has estimated that 1 in 3 households are addicted to heroin or other opium derivatives. Your thoughts?
You know, and I think this also, too, is a great example of people sometimes struggle to understand, well, how does this war affect us here in the United States? And the DEA claims that Afghan heroin is not showing up on our streets. Afghan fentanyl is not showing up on our streets. From everything I've looked at it, Mexico and Colombia do not have the hectarage to produce the volume of heroin and fentanyl and other opiates that the United States consumes. Now, yeah, it's true that most opiate consumption in the U.S. is pharmaceutical based, illicit, not illicit, and that's abuse. But when those people run out, what do they go to? They go to heroin, and then they go on to fentanyl, right? But it would not be a surprise, of course. I mean, anyone who trusts the DEA on this certainly, doesn't know the history of this, doesn't understand the DEA actually has an office of political affairs that is meant to provide cover for all our warlord friends around the world. So, the story I told was about Golag or Sherzai, but that story can get repeated over and over again. Sherzai was the man described earlier who the U.S. put back into power in Kandahar, right? I mean, the program was called the Governor's Eradication Program or something like that. And for basically rubbing out his competition, we gave him $10 million, and we repeated that around the country. The idea that the Taliban is somehow the major drug player in Afghanistan that controls the drug trade is simply not true. And it's just been a myth that has helped, propel this war along, this narco-terror nexus that people like to describe. The people who have run the drug trade for the last 20 years has been the Afghan government, have been the Afghan military. When I was there, Hamid Karzai's brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, who was the governor of Kandahar, the second most populous province, second biggest city, was the major drug lord of southern Afghanistan, which was the biggest drug production area in Afghanistan. He was Scarface, basically. The same you go up to the north. Muhammad Adanur was another one who controlled the drug trade out there. Gulag Shirzai in the east. You have this over and over again where the allies, the men that the U.S. put in power and kept in power, ran the drug trade. And yeah, the Taliban did get some money from the drug trade. They were insurgency, or they're going to tax anything that they could. And the drug trade was available to tax. And of course, elements of the Taliban were involved in it. It was the only industry that was there. Of course they would be. However, the control of the drug trade was and has been, and up until now, was controlled by the Afghan government. The sources of funding for the Taliban in order of prominence, as far as I knew as a State Department officer reading the intelligence and assessments, were, starting with the least prominent, the drug trade, then American contracts that they siphoned off or sometimes got directly themselves, support from the Pakistanis, which was also money from the U.S. in many ways. But by far the biggest support for the Taliban these last 20 years have come from the Gulf monarchies, have come from the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainis, the Qataris, the Emiratis. But however, that is hardly ever discussed or brought up, even though it is pretty common knowledge. I mean, I didn't disclose any state secrets right there,
So supposedly there's a lot of lithium there, almost the same amount as going to rival, Bolivia. So they could develop this lithium, but how are we going to react to them? Do you think that we're going to learn from our past lessons? We're going to recognize the Taliban government, keep our embassy open, continue to provide humanitarian aid, unfreeze their assets, and help them develop along? Or are we going to go back to our old ways with the CIA secretly funding the warlords that are already starting to form, opposition forces? Is there any chance that the U.S. is going to handle this thing right going forward?
I like quoting Yogi Berra, predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. But I think the history of the relationship between the United States CIA and the warlord, the alliances, the friendship, basically, I would expect that is going to weigh heavy in decision making, because you have people right now in Washington, D.C. who are looking at Afghanistan saying, hey, you know what? This is no different than September 10th, 2001. Taliban controlled most of the country. There are some warlords holding out in some provinces. There are some warlords outside the country. We can redo this. We did it once. We can do it again. And now, of course, that hubris, that arrogance, that ignorance that defines American foreign policy so well comes into play. This time we can do it better. So that's my fear, is that what will happen. I hope that there is this cruel, unjust, unfair peace in Afghanistan that allows for reconstruction or rebuilding and reconciliation. But I don't know, but we'll see. But yeah, I need to drop off.
And real quickly, you could just do a yes or no. Do you believe that the Taliban will impose Sharia law more softly, and there will be limited rights for women, like they say, or do you think they're full of it?
I don't know. I really don't. I think the Taliban leadership is sincere to a degree, because they need the money to keep coming in, right? They need that support. They don't want to have economic collapse. There will certainly not be a democracy in Afghanistan, that's for sure. I think the situation with the women, for most Afghan women, 75% of Afghan women live outside the cities. The majority of Afghan women will not see a change in their lives. I mean, I knew guys in Afghanistan who were there for 7 months, 9 months, a year, who never saw a woman. And this was in American and government controlled areas because they were confined to their homes. In my time in Afghanistan, when I was not in Kabul, which was most of the time, in that 5-month period, I saw 2 women outside of their homes. And every place I was in an American controlled, NATO controlled, government controlled area. So the idea that things are fundamentally going to get worse for Afghan women, for some women in Kabul and other cities, absolutely. No question. But for the vast majority of Afghan women, I don't think they'll see a difference. But yeah, we'll see. The biggest thing I think you can say about the war is it's a 40-year revenge cycle. So people are going to be taking revenge, retaliating. There's so much that is out of the control of anyone who thinks they can control it, that where this goes. And I think the thing to say about all this is that, looking back, look at Afghanistan, look what everyone thought was going to happen, how they thought they were going to control it, what they thought the outcomes were going to be. And things always got worse somehow. Things always got, the violence increased somehow, or these splinter groups or groups that were worse than the Taliban. I mean, it's not the Taliban who are the worst people in Afghanistan right now. It's the Islamic State. I mean, so what comes next after the Islamic State? Yeah. So, but okay, Lauren, Ryan, thank you.
Matthew. Ryan, I'll let you answer that question.
It will be softer than the 1990s, though that's not saying a whole lot. You know, the barbarism that was on display by the Taliban is just, you know, leaves you speechless. I do not think that there will be executions of women in soccer stadiums for, you know, for talking to a man, but I don't think that kind of thing.
What about my first question? Do you think that the U.S. is going to recognize the Taliban as legitimate government, unfreeze their assets, provide humanitarian aid, keep the embassy open?
I think at some point they'll release the central bank money, that they will recognize the Taliban. Maybe they're going to, I don't know. I know that there will be elements pushing to do that, but then nobody's going to want to take that political hit for doing it. So they might just never do it. Right now they have an open line of communication, clearly, so that they can establish the terms of this exit. And I don't see any reason why that would necessarily close up. Like Matthew said, the Taliban have a lot of interest in keeping the economy from absolutely bottoming out. But on the other hand, a lot of what the Taliban is saying is sophisticated PR, and they are full of it in a lot of senses. And it's going to be very bad for a lot of people. His point that there won't be much change for lots of people is also worth keeping in mind.
Politically, both sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, are really bashing Biden over this decision, which I know you think is a good decision, as do I. What are they gaining by this bashing? And especially the Democrats, are they hurting Biden's ability, especially in these sensitive negotiations with the infrastructure package and the reconciliation package?
I don't think they are. In some ways, they could be helping him in this sense. Like, so you've got a couple of moderates that want to try to slow the process down, and you could tell them, look, he's already weakened by what's going on in Afghanistan. You really want to kill his presidency? Like, you want to be the person that kills his presidency over what? So in that sense, I could see it going both ways. But, you know, for a lot of these people, their first allegiance is to the war machine, and he committed the cardinal sin of not listening to his generals and to ending a war, and they're letting him have it.
Yeah. Final question, not related to Afghanistan. You've been going back and forth on Twitter, and I was a part of that exchange about who's going to fold first, the moderates or the progressives, as far as the infrastructure bill. It looks like Nancy Pelosi is holding out and saying she's not going to vote on the infrastructure bill until the reconciliation bill is passed. Do you think that she's going to stick with that? Because if she does, that's going to be good.
Yes. I mean, the question of who's going to win a standoff between Nancy Pelosi and Josh Gottheimer is kind of an absurd one on its face. It's Nancy Pelosi. Like, Josh Gottheimer does not have, he has these 9 people, including himself, on this list. Like, get out of here with this. I went through the list in my article. It's not a serious list. I think he can hold on to Schrader, Kurt Schrader, former head of the Blue Dogs. And I think she'll let Jared Golden vote no, but the other 6 will vote with Pelosi. One of them, for instance, Carolyn Bordeaux, a freshman from suburban Atlanta, her big priority for re-election is this Medicaid expansion, like a Medicaid lookalike expansion thing, that it would give Medicaid money to states that refused Medicaid money. It's a Warnock measure. It's a Raphael Warnock measure. Warnock's up for re-election. So both Warnock and Bordeaux need that for their re-election. It's in the reconciliation bill. She's like going this weekend to a fundraiser in California with Pelosi, and Gottheimer thinks she's on his team. She signed a letter to look like a deficit, somebody who's concerned about the deficit, but like, and Pelosi would not be behaving the way she is if she didn't know for certain that she had these votes.
But independently of the 9, do you think she really is going to hold out and side with the Progressive Caucus and say, we're not going to vote on the infrastructure bill until the reconciliation is approved?
Yep. She sees it as her legacy. This is her last chance to get something big done. The child tax credit is in the reconciliation package. If she can go down in history, I'm sure she's telling herself as the speaker who cut child poverty in half. She would love to have that because the ACA is a wounded legacy item.
Yeah. And
So
do you think that Manchin and Sinema are going to go along with it in the end?
In the end, I think they'll take a chunk out of it, but they'll go along with it.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Ryan. I'm going to let you go so I can promote my upcoming show. On Sunday, we're going to be talking about the recall against Gavin Newsom in my old state of California, which looks pretty likely. The polling seems to be at about 50-50. And his opponent there, Larry Elder, is a conservative radio talk show host who is against vaccine mandates, against mask mandates, who doesn't believe in climate change, who wants to roll back all these environmental regulations. He's absolutely horrible. And the Democrats are, who were not particularly enthusiastic about Newsom because he's been a disappointment to the progressive wing, especially, are starting to kind of rally. But is it going to be enough, and is it going to be too late? So on Sunday, I'm going to be talking with some people from Southern, Northern, and possibly Central California progressives about what they think is likely, what they're doing for Newsom, why they didn't ask for anything in return, such as single-payer health care and a ban on fracking. But I want to thank everybody for watching. Please share this show. I am not getting the kind of viewership I used to get in the old days. And if anybody stuck with this show for the whole hour, you will see that you cannot get this kind of analysis on the corporate media. And I think it's really invaluable that people understand why we are in the situation that we are, informed by history, which is something that you're just not getting from the mainstream media, who are interviewing the very architects of this policy, Petraeus, Bolton, other warmongers. It's just really outrageous. They're not interviewing historians and people who were had a different point of view. Please share this show, continue to watch, and keep fighting.